Right. As the title slide suggests, this is the biggie. This is the one on constitutional principles. So, engage brain. Get your presentation ready because you will have questions you want to ask, and there will be areas where you need to pause this video and think about things. So, let's push on. We're going to start then by just highlighting exactly what we're talking about here. These are the 5 pillars of the Constitution, the principles of the Constitution that are held to have emerged from the mists of time, and they support the wider Constitution. When we boil the Constitution down, when we boil down 800, 900 years of British political history, these are the themes that are left. These are the things that run through our British political history like Blackpool through Blackpool Rock. So, what do they mean? We're going to start with the sovereignty of Parliament, and really what I want you to get your head around is this. Parliament, and only Parliament, gets to make law, gets to make statute law, and once they've made that law, no one else gets to mess with it. So, what does that mean? Well, Dicey defines it as the legal supremacy of acts of Parliament, and here they are. So there are 3 key ideas to that. There is no area of law that Parliament can't consider to make laws about. There is no one else who can mess with Parliament's properly enacted law, and no Parliament can bind a future Parliament. If you want to know how that works in practice, the best place to go is the Merchant Shipping Act and the Facta Tami case. And if you look that one up yourselves, you'll be doing yourselves a tremendous favour. Facta Tami case, Factor Tami case, which relates to the Merchant Shipping Act. Look at that, get your head around it, and you will be in good shape. Assessing it, well, again, it doesn't mean that Parliament is the highest decision-making body. That, of course, is government. It doesn't mean that politics is the most powerful body. That would be the people, because, of course, the people are the political sovereigns. And it doesn't mean that Parliament wears a crown, because that's just silly. So, the legal sovereignty of Parliament, parliamentary sovereignty, means that it is the highest legal authority in the land. Now, have a look at these ideas. There are 5 different questions there. Do these affect parliamentary sovereignty? And while you're thinking about that, I suggest you hit pause. Okay, you should be back in the room now. We'll get rid of that and we'll look at those questions in their detail. The principle that we're looking at here is that Parliament can make law. It is the only body that can make law. No other entity can mess with law, and Parliament cannot bind a future Parliament. No Parliament can make a law that a future government cannot, or a future Parliament, cannot change. It's not laid down in law, because if it were, it would be possible to repeal it. Let's go back to those questions. Do elections, referendums challenge parliamentary sovereignty? No, because it's about law, not about making the decision. What about devolution? Well, yes and no. The key point being this one here: whatever Parliament giveth, Parliament can taketh away. And I'll talk about that in a minute. EU, well, it's exactly the same idea. Whatever Parliament giveth, Parliament can taketh away. Parliamentary sovereignty remains intact. Outside influences, only Parliament can make and unmake law, so sovereignty is retained. Let's have a look at that. Superior agreements. These are related to agreements that Parliament has entered into voluntarily, and therefore Parliament can back out of them. Again, key ideas here: the European Communities Act, the Human Rights Act, and so on. Let's have a look at what that means. Here's Parliament. It's bound by constitutional principles, and of course 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There are 5 of those. We're looking at parliamentary sovereignty. We're going to look at the rule of law. We're going to look at parliamentary government. We're going to look at constitutional monarchy. And we're going to look at the unitary state. But right now, it's parliamentary sovereignty. Okay, so what does this mean? Constitutional principles, yes, Parliament is bound by those. But then we passed the European Communities Act in 1972, and that said we're going to play the European Act, and so we are bound by European law. Voluntarily, we have bound ourselves to European law. But this no more infringes our sovereignty then our personal sovereignty might be infringed when we're playing rugby. When we're playing rugby, we can only pass the ball backwards. But if we're not playing rugby, we can do whatever we like with a rugby ball. We can kick it, we can throw it in the bin. Doesn't really matter. So if we were, for example, to reject membership of the EU, then of course we wouldn't be bound by EU law and we'd be right back where we are. And so sovereignty is essentially suspended or ceded to the EU for the purposes of playing the EU game. Now, the same applies really with devolution, except it's the other way around. In this case, what we've got are three acts of Parliament that essentially kick devolution down kick sovereignty a little bit further down the line. So here we are. We've got the the British Parliament there, and of course within that we've got Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales. We have those laws which have essentially created little pockets of sovereignty in Cardiff, in Edinburgh, and of course in Dublin. The best way to look at that is to think about the way in which Scotland now have control of education and health, and that of course becomes significant when we think about tuition fees. Why is it that Scottish kids will not pay tuition fees when they go to university? Well, because that was tangled up in this particular law. When they passed this law, they said, oh yeah, and by the way, you'll have control of education. And the Scottish government took a view that they were going to get rid of tuition fees. And so when you're sitting in your halls, your Scottish neighbour will have more money to spend on beer, which is probably all right because they kind of like it. And I can say that with a degree of authority, having grown up in Scotland. Of course, the point is, having given this degree of sovereignty to the regions, Parliament can, of course, take it away. And if that were to happen, then, of course, the self-rule of the regions would be dissolved. Funnily enough, you may be aware at time of going to press, which is September 2015, there is talk that Northern Ireland's devolution may be suspended. Direct rule will be reimposed by Westminster if the Northern Ireland Assembly can't get its act together. Something perhaps we can discuss in class. This has happened before. This happened, I think, in 2003, when self-rule was suspended and direct rule from Westminster applied because they couldn't get their act together. Again, we can talk about that in class. So, what about the Legislative and Regulatory Reform Bill, I hear you ask? Well, I'm glad you did. This was a peculiar bill that in its original form would have allowed government to pass primary legislation. And that, of course, would have been a violation of parliamentary sovereignty, which is why the House of Lords said, we're not going to pass that. And it went back and it was finally passed in a profoundly reformed position. Again, complicated. I will explain that in class if you come along with questions. But anyway, that is parliamentary sovereignty. Let's have a quick look now at the rule of law. And the rule of law needs to be understood in this sense. All laws apply to all people at all times and all in the same way. Now, there are more complicated definitions of the rule of law out there, but trust me, this one works at a cognitive level. If this is how you understand the rule of law, then everything will follow, even if you have to learn a slightly more complicated definition when the time comes. Now, what is the rule of law? The rule of law says that all laws apply to all people at all times, and that is a safeguard against arbitrary government. And arbitrary, of course, means basically making it up as you go along. If you have the rule of law, the government cannot simply change the rules as it sees fit. We can contrast that by looking at Stalin and Khrushchev. The first thing Khrushchev did when he got into power was to create a whole long list of things for which you could be executed. That doesn't sound like progress until you look at Stalin, where there was no list, and basically you could just be executed depending upon how Stalin felt at any given time. So, that is the rule of law. It's safeguards against arbitrary government, and it is an established procedure, blah, 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 blah. Normally requires independent arbitration, but we'll worry about that when we come to look at it. Now, these are the technical definitions of the rule of law from Dicey, who will you remember from our constitutional sources. Well, hey, this is one of those works of authority that everyone loves so much. Hopefully, at some point, these PowerPoints will be incorporated into that august pantheon. Now, you'll remember this one as well, because this one here describes how the general principles of the British Constitution are beyond the reach of the rulers. So in other words, Parliament or government cannot decide, hey, you know what we do? We're going to take the rule of law and we're going to abolish it. They can't do that. Nor can they take the principle of parliamentary government and decide, you know, that's frankly a bit too much bother. We'll do away with that. No, they can't. The problem, however, is that these things are not judiciable. But we'll worry about that when we come to it. Now, parliamentary government. Complicated idea, but it is critical, absolutely critical that you understand that government, lacking any intrinsic authority, relies on Parliament for its authority and its legitimacy. Now, what does that mean? That means that when we voted, we did not vote for government. Government was not part of our electoral deal with the people, with the Parliament. What we did was that we voted for Parliament. And from Parliament, government emerges. Parliament has legal authority. Government has derived authority, and it is entirely conditional on it meeting the terms of parliamentary government. Now, this is a very, very complicated idea, but if you can get your head around the idea that government only exists as long as Parliament allows it to, then you're going to be in pretty good shape going forward. There should be nothing at all in this particular course that bothers you. However, the more complete your grasp of parliamentary government, the better you are going to be. So what does it mean in practice? Parliamentary sovereignty decrees that there can be no higher authority. Government can only act with the consent of Parliament. What does that mean? It means that government has to be chosen from Parliament. All members of government must be drawn from Parliament. So in other words, all members of government must either be from the House of Commons or the House of Lords. And we'll look at plenty of examples of how that works as the course progresses. It means that government has to operate through Parliament. That means that whatever the government wants to achieve can only be achieved with Parliament's say-so. The complication that comes there is something called the royal prerogative, and we will look at that when the time allows. But right now, all you need to know is that your government is obliged to operate through Parliament, but more importantly, perhaps, to be accountable to Parliament. Parliament, at any time, can turn around to the government and say, "Oi, what exactly do you think you're doing?" Government lacks any intrinsic authority, and it relies entirely upon Parliament for its legitimacy. If Parliament calls time on a government, then government has to go. And this happened in 1979 when we had what we call a confidence or essential motion. The government lost the censure motion and it had to resign. That was under the premiership of the Labour leader, James Callaghan. Last time it happened, we haven't had an example since then. Who knows when we might have one next? Perhaps with a Conservative wafer-thin majority, it may yet happen within your political lifetime. Now, this is just a little bit on democratic government. You need to remember this, and you can just contrast that with the general idea of parliamentary government. Now, the unitary state is another constitutional principle, and again, it's kind of complicated. It's the idea that power is held by one indivisible government entity, and indeed, there is one there is that one state that follows from it. Devolution, well, you should know all about that. The idea that Parliament gives authority to the regions, they can take it back. We've done this one already. So the unitary state is essentially preserved. And again, pause, have a read of that, and hopefully it will make sense. We'll consider it in class. Devolution versus federalism, again, have a look at that. I will answer your questions in class. The reason I'm moving on is that I've only got 56 seconds left, so I better get a move on and look at the constitutional monarchy. This is the idea that the monarch is no longer appointed by God, but instead by government or by Parliament. Parliament assumed power in the Glorious Revolution of 1688. The monarch retains the role as the head of state. Government holds and exercises authority on behalf of the monarch. Now, this again brings us back to the royal prerogative. It's the idea that the powers of the crown have passed to the government to exercise on her or his behalf. We will consider that in class. And there we go. I've actually made it with 30 seconds to spare. You must have questions. there is no way that that could all be entirely clear. So please, questions to the usual address, please. See you soon. Bye.